Today we are going to be talking about Chapter 3, which is about federalism. Federalism is a way of organizing a nation so that two or more levels of government have formal authority over the land or people. So I have pictures down here to help you understand this. We have government that's over our whole nation, that's in Washington, D.C. That's our national government or federal government or central government. And then we have state governments. Indiana is our state, so we have a government in Indianapolis. And even below that, we have local governments, like Marion County or Indianapolis or things like that. Or even Wayne Township is even a lower level. So federalism is the way that these levels of government work together over the land and people. And federalism also has to do with intergovernmental relations, the working of the federal system, the entire set of interactions among national, state, and local governments. So not only that we have these different levels of government, but how they work together to control, various aspects of our lives. So we're going to review some things we learned during week 1. There are 3 types of government systems that determine where the power is located. The first type is unitary, where all the power is in a central or national government. There's no state governments. Some examples of places that have unitary governments are Japan, France, and Saudi Arabia. For example, they are smaller areas, like physical areas, so they don't need many state and regional governments. The federal system has a central and regional government that both have power. The United States, Canada, Australia, and India have federal system of government. And again, these are places with large geographic areas, so they might need more regional governments to get close to the people. And then confederate systems of government is where the states have the power, and the national government isn't really very powerful. It just holds the states together as like a union that they back one another up. Some examples of this would have been the Confederacy during the Civil War, the European Union today, where each country is still its own sovereign state, but they kind of work together, and then the United Nations, where all of our countries in the world that are members are their own sovereign nations, but the United Nations is kind of a body that kind of unites us. So, the United States chooses the federal option, where we have central and regional governments. And why is federalism so important? This is a huge part of how our government works. Here's some things of the way it affects our government. It decentralizes our politics. If we only had a government in our central government in Washington, D.C., it'd be a lot harder for people to get involved and participate, especially if they live far away from there. So having state and regional governments decentralizes our politics so that people could get involved on the state level, in the local level, and things like that. It also decentralizes our policies. Instead of having only the same policies out of Washington, D.C. for everywhere on every issue, the state government can handle some smaller problems that might be more relative to the state, like regulating drinking ages, marriage, speed limits, things like that. Also, states can have the power to solve the same problem in different ways. Like, for example, if Indiana finds a way to serve its people better than because it knows its people better, then that's okay. And sometimes then states come up with policies that then get used by the national government. An example would be welfare policy. I think it was Minnesota that came out with a very innovative welfare policy in the 90s, and the national government said, well, that worked really well, let's try it for the whole country. So states can come up with ideas and become policy innovators. So these are some reasons why it's important that we have federalism. So there's more opportunities for people to participate, and we have policies that fit the more local areas. So here's just a graphic that shows you how many types of governments we have in the United States. We have our national government, 50 state governments, over 3,000 counties, over 19,000 municipalities, over 16,000 towns, 13,000 school districts. Municipalities would be cities. And 35,000 special districts, and those maybe would be police districts or voting districts and things like that. So over 87,000 different levels of government in the United States. So federalism is very prevalent in our country. So how do we know we have federalism? Because the Constitution tells us so. Here's the important parts of the Constitution that set up federalism. The Supremacy Clause, which is Article 6 of the Constitution, states that the following are supreme. The U.S. Constitution, laws of Congress, and treaties are supreme laws of our land. They come above the state. But the national government cannot usurp meaning take state powers, according to the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says any power not given to the national government is reserved to the states. There are reserved powers to the states. So if the U.S. Constitution or laws of Congress or treaties do not specify that the national government should do something, then the states have those powers and they cannot be taken away. So this, combining these two items, creates the division of power or federalism in our country. Also, we've had some court cases that have established the fact that the national government is supreme. The most important one you need to know is McCulloch versus Maryland. This is another court case where you do not have to learn the details of the case, but just the result. It was a complicated case about banks taxing the national government, and basically the national government won out. The Supreme Court said that even though it's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, there are implied powers in the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution that give the national government the powers that it wanted. So the national government, even if it's not specifically stated in the Constitution, has implied powers through the necessary and proper clause. You should write that down. And that was decided in McCulloch versus Maryland. The necessary and proper clause is also known as the elastic clause. Okay? Another court case was Gibbons versus Ogden. This is where the federal government wanted to regulate an issue, but the state said it did not have power to do so. Gibbons versus Ogden cited the commerce powers, the power to regulate interstate commerce, trade between states, to give the national government the power to do what it wanted to do. So the implied powers in the necessary and proper clause and the powers of commerce regulation between states are what have strengthened the power of the national government over the states. Also, the Civil War, the states tried to say that they should have the say, but the Civil War was won by the Union, so the national government remains supreme. And also, the battle for racial equality has emphasized how the national government is supreme. Different states wanted to be able to discriminate against minorities, denying them access to jobs and schools and things like that. But the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus the Board of Education that states could not use separate but equal anymore, and emphasized that the national government had a national standard against discrimination. So all of these things establish that our national government is supreme. In our next section, we're going to start by looking at what specific powers are held by the different parts of government. So we're going to start with what powers are given to the national government in the Constitution. This top row refers to the most basic type of power given to the national government, the expressed powers, or the enumerated powers, which basically means the powers explicitly granted to Congress in the Constitution. They are specifically listed. We can read them. They're in Article 1, Section 8, and they are things like declaring war, coining money, levying taxes, regulating interstate commerce. These are the powers specifically given to the national government. To get more complicated, though, there are also implied powers in the Constitution, which I talked about in the last video clip a little bit. There's a part of the Constitution called the Necessary and Proper Clause in Article 1, Section 8. It's also known as the Elastic Clause, which says that Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper to carry out those expressed powers. So this has been interpreted to believe that Congress has assumed other powers that are implied in the Constitution to better carry out their express powers. And you may know that implied means hinted at. It's not specifically stated, but hinted at. But then we had the court case McCulloch versus Maryland, which really verified that the national government does have those implied powers in the necessary and proper clause. And some examples are things that Congress has done that aren't specifically listed in the Constitution but are implied to be their power based on what the express powers tell them to do. Regulating telecommunications, building interstate highways, and often these things have been expanded through the Commerce Clause through that court case Gibbons versus Ogden. So remember how we said the Constitution is a kind of a living document, that they didn't know everything Congress would need to do when they wrote it? They put in this necessary and proper clause so as time went on, people could decipher what new things that Congress would need to do for the people that they didn't know back then. The last type that Congress is given are inherent powers. The word inherent means basically just a given. It doesn't need to be stated. And really, these are powers that are inherent to any sovereign nation, that no matter what country you are, if you are in control of yourself, you have these powers. And the preamble hints at these, but basically, they are the power to defend itself from foreign and domestic enemies. Like, no matter what, if you're a country, if somebody attacks you, you can defend itself, and that doesn't have to be stated in the Constitution. So these are three of the main types of powers given to the national government. Next, we're going to look at some other types of powers that incorporate the states a little bit more. The first is reserved powers. Reserved powers are those not given to the national government and not prohibited to the states. The 10th Amendment says that any power not given to the national government is reserved to the states. So that's how we get the fact that we have state governments that can do things that the national government doesn't do. Some examples are that they have to create a republican form of government, they can charter local governments, they get to conduct elections, they get to issue licenses, like professional licenses. They also do things like education. So these are all state powers. The next one is a concurrent power, which is a power shared by the national and state government. These are things that both get to do. Some examples are taxing, borrowing and spending, establishing courts, passing and enforcing laws, and protecting rights. So states get to do all these things too, as long as they're not contradicting the national government. And last but not least is prohibited. These are powers that the national government cannot do according to Article 1, Section 9. Powers prohibited to the national government. They cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus, which we're talking about this week, and they can also not tax exports. So those are some explanations of powers in the national government. And here are some more things in the Constitution that remind us of our national government's powers. We have, in the Constitution, states have obligations to one another as well as to the national government. The Full Faith and Credit Clause says that each state must recognize official documents and judgments rendered by other states, according to Article 4, Section 1 of the Constitution. What that means is that states must, if you're married in one state, accept that you're married in other states. There's, of course, the exception of the whole gay marriage thing, which we'll talk about in class. Also, things like your birth certificate should be valid in one state and another. Your driver's license, you don't have to get another driver's license to drive in another state. So they have to recognize the legal documents of one state to another. Also, privileges and immunities. Citizens of each state have privileges of citizens of other states. So they can't say, you know, because you're not originally from the state, you're not entitled to these privileges. The only example is that if you don't pay taxes in a state, then you don't get benefits of things like maybe in-state school tuition.